Although today we can call Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah states of the United States, this wasn't always the case. On February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed as an end to the Mexican-American War. The document stated that any Mexican living on the now American side of the border would be considered Mexican-American and be granted full citizenship. However, that did not happen, and in the long run, Mexican-Americans were mistreated by both sides of the border. They were neither Mexican or American enough for them. However, around the 1960s, they stopped letting others make them inferior and began holding the government accountable. This shift, inspired by the African American civil rights movement, gave a new perspective, which gave them the ability to make the movement as big as it is today. The Chicano movement forged huge breakthroughs that held the government responsible for their neglect towards equity rights and education, labor, and justice for Mexican Americans. The Treaty of Guadalupe could be the farthest traced route of what is now known as the Chicano movement. It was signed on February 2nd, 1848. The settlement Mexico made was to cede what we now know as Upper California and New Mexico. Therefore, following what the agreement stated, any Mexican living on the now American side of the border would be considered Mexican-American and be granted full citizenship. However, that didn't fully happen, and in their day-to-day lives, Mexican-Americans would face discrimination, racism, and work exploitation. Not only were schools segregated between white children and children of Mexican descent, but jobs didn't provide basic human necessities such as toilets, and farm workers would be called degenerates by their bosses. Mendez versus Westminster would be a game changer for the Mexican-American community. The court case could also be considered as one of the stage setters of the movement. Gonzalo Mendez, along with 4 other families, took 4 Los Angeles school districts to court. The reason was that his child, Sylvia Mendez, was turned away from a Californian public school for whites only. The Mendez family would be represented by civil rights attorney David Marcus. David Marcus would use an unusual take on evidence in the case. He argued with a social science approach about how segregation resulted in feelings of inferiority among Mexican-American children that affected their productivity as fellow Americans. Trial lasted 2 weeks, during which, according to United States courts, U.S. District Court Judge Paul J. McCormick agreed with the plaintiffs and ordered that the school district cease their discriminatory practices against the pupils of Mexican descent in public schools. The schools filed for an appeal, which the court accepted, and they would appeal Judge McCormick's ruling. Despite that, the governor of California, Ellen Warren, signed a bill ending school segregation, thus making California the first state to end segregation in public schools. The court case paved the way for Brown v. Board of Education. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws in public schools were a violation of the principles of the 14th Amendment, which consequently ended segregation in the United States. Despite legal victories like Mendez versus Westminster, children still suffered significant inequalities within schools. Parents' frequent employment-related relocations and economic instability made Chicano children unable to settle in a single school. On the rare occasion that they were able to stay, language barriers and no bilingual educators made school difficult. These obstacles caused most to fall behind academically, and as a result, only a few would graduate. Schools in predominantly white areas would get more funding than those in predominantly Chicano poorer areas, worsening educational inequalities within the two groups. According to a Latinx resource guide, the East Los Angeles walkouts reflected a mass response to these discrepancies. Students walked out of their classroom in protest, who together formed the Educational Issues Coordinating Committee. The Educational Issues Coordinating Committee presented a list of demands to the Los Angeles Board of Education, which unfortunately got rejected for funding issues. The East Los Angeles walkouts demonstrated students' civil rights activism for a better education despite setbacks caused by educational leaders.
The most important thing about my move to me was that I was frustrated.
Another significant case that drew up the media and public attention was the death of Rubén Salazar, a very public activist and reporter of the Chicano movement. On August 29, 1970, during the National Chicano Moratorium against the Vietnam War in East Los Angeles, which began as a peaceful march, escalated into violence when the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department intervened. When the 1,500 police officers arrived at Laguna Park, they shot tear gas canisters into the crowd and assaulted the protesters. Their intervention would take the lives of 3 individuals, including Rubén Salazar. According to the Los Angeles County Office of Independent Review, the instantly fatal shot fired by Deputy Thomas Wilson killed Salazar. His death was mourned by the Mexican-American community and became a symbol of police aggression towards Chicanos. Unfortunately, the officer was never charged, which highlighted the government's negligence and failure to protect Chicanos' lives and rights.
With the establishment about her.
Under the law, it would seem as if Mexican Americans were treated as fairly as fellow white citizens due to the Guadalupe Treaty, but this was simply not the case. Farm workers were not only mistreated and exploited by their employers, but they were also publicly humiliated by them when they would refer to them as degenerates and alcoholics. Many were paid even lower than the minimum wage, and the fields did not include basic necessities such as toilets. By participating in a protest and organization, many faced making themselves vulnerable, with the possibility of being fired and removed from their housing provided by their employers. Yet with all these obstacles, many decided to fight head-on under the leadership of the United Farm Workers and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. According to the National Park Service, Cesar Chavez National Monument, the strike was more than an economic issue to the farm workers of the Llano. It was about their basic rights as American workers. The 5-year-long strike began to gain support across the United States, and as a result, in July 1970, most of the major growers in the Delano area agreed to pay a grape picker $1.80 an hour, contribute to the union health plan, and ensure that their workers were protected against pesticides used in the fields. The creation of such organizations not only made Chicanos powerful through their unification, but also drew attention to the ongoing distinct labor practices in the United States. As previously stated, different examples have been outstanding throughout history where we find different situations that have the same similarity, which is the inequality that exists when administering justice, such as working conditions, education, and social assistance, which are administered and executed by the government. Thus, we examine the 14th Amendment. No state shall make or enforce any law abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. This is precisely where it speaks of the importation of equality in all of its social areas to its citizens, and is where all these events that are mentioned here can be framed. Although some may argue that the Chicano movement was not influential at all, it was, due to the people who fought for the cause. Knowing as individuals that by making this life-changing decision, your children, grandchildren, and future generations to come would enjoy a better and more just world than your own was the reward they desired.